Mishpatim. So I was trying to remember a drash or a commentary that I had read, and I can't find it on this parsha, but I know that it exists somewhere. That the difference between mishpatim and chukim, which are both terms that come up frequently throughout the Torah as like the laws, is that mishpatim are civil laws. They are laws that follow a human logic and largely have to do with how we treat each other. They're largely about like liability, after the fact of a crime, things like that. Whereas hukim or edot or other types of laws that we see these other synonyms used in the Hebrew throughout the Torah, they are God laws. They are laws that like don't really follow necessarily any explained logic, like kashrut or the mixing of wool and linen and things like that, that are just like because God says so. So I think that sets an important tone for this week's parsha as we look at these laws. That these are mishpatim. These are the laws that govern our civil society. These are the laws that follow a specific logic and that allow us to live peaceably and justly with each other. Although there is, so I would think like because of that, they are universal in a way that, for example, kashrut or mixing fabrics doesn't have to be, because it's not about person to person. It's about the relationship between Israel and God. But these being civil laws, I would think would be more universal. But Rashi has a comment here on this first line: "Ve'ele hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem." Lifnehem means before them, and Rashi says, and not before the heathens. So even these apparently are very specifically laws for the people of Israel, which is interesting because I don't know, because they're about how we treat each other and like what, I don't know. There's a limit to that if it's not applied to everybody, but it is applied to everybody in the Israel like camp. I mean, that is made clear in other places throughout the Torah. Clearly is that anyone who lives with them has to live by the same laws, and is treated fairly and equally under the legal system as well. By virtue of choosing to live among the Israelites, you sort of become one, even though this is way before any kind of formal conversion ritual exists. So other things that come up in this parsha, there's not a lot of narrative. It's mostly just laws, but some of the ones that I think are relevant is there are laws about servitude, which I think is interesting. As we mentioned, I think last week, or we talked a little bit before about the sort of surprising nature of these people who have just come out of slavery still cannot envision a world without slavery, that they are setting up these laws for a more fair system of servitude, but the idea that like you just shouldn't own other humans like hasn't occurred to them. So that comes up again in this parsha. This parsha contains a lot, like a liability clause or like a case law about personal injury stuff, regarding a fight breaks out and a woman is injured and it causes her to miscarry, and there is a liability, personal injury issue with that, but it's not murder. So based on this, all of the rabbinic laws regarding abortion are based. That's significant. In that same section, there's also some clauses about self-defense when facing a thief. And based on this, we have a whole body of rabbinic law about what's called the rodef and like how to deal with someone who is going to commit a crime and like what the rules are to stop them, like self-defense versus excessive force. It depends on what the crime is that they're going to commit, how much time, like how much lead up you know they're about to commit it versus they are in the act of committing it and you're stopping them. There's a really robust tractate of Talmud on that. That's interesting. That comes from this parsha. There are laws about lending and borrowing and protections for the poor and the worker. But I have to say I don't know of specifically the Talmudic conversations that arise from this, but I do know that there's an entire volume of Shulchan Aruch of the codified Jewish law, which means there must be conversations in the Talmud about it. I just haven't come across them that discuss this and like how to what the fairness laws are for lending and borrowing and paying your workers and things like that come from this. The Shemitah is introduced. The 3 festivals are not introduced, but again, it's one of the many places where we are told what the laws regarding the 3 festivals, foot festivals are. And yeah, so on. There's other stuff, but those are the ones that I find most interesting. I don't know if others picked up on other stuff that they'd like to discuss.
I thought it was interesting, some of the laws associated with slaves, especially since when it discusses if the slave has a wife given by the master, how, when he gets his freedom after, 6 years or something like that, then he has to leave her and the kids behind.
Yeah. Yeah. But if he has a wife when he comes, like if they bought a husband and wife together, they can free them together. And the wife, I think eventually, I mean, nobody is enslaved for life in the Jewish or the Israelite form, but I guess like they couldn't exchange phone numbers. So if the wife was freed 7 years later, it might be hard to reconnect. There is there's a drash or a commentary on this. Where is it? The ritual for, no, I've passed it. The ritual for a slave who wants to stay with his master. Yeah, the master shall pierce his ear with an awl, like to the doorpost. He like nails the ear to the doorpost. And let's see, is it Rashi? I don't know, I don't see it right here. But there's a drash that like, because the ear is, how we receive commands for the most part, right? We hear them. So a slave that chooses to give over his autonomy and chooses to continue to follow the commands of a fellow human over God, that mark is then made by the ear to signify that they have chosen to close their ears to God and follow only a human master, which I think is a powerful indictment of choosing continued servitude. Although with the wife thing, I mean, it could be a coercive choice. Joel, did you have something to add to that?
I just want to mention we have a lot of people in my neighborhood that I think chose to stay with the master because they have these big piercings in their ear. I'm just sure of it. So about the first issue, yeah, I was trying to think that through also. And I came across some wonderful words. It's the last line of what I put in the chat. It's the difference between apodictic law versus casuistic law. So apodictic is what we would talk about as a chok. Chok means that's just how it is. Don't try to figure it out.
Yeah.
The other one refers to Mishpatim. So the word Mishpatim, of course, is from the root shofet. Shofet means a judge. We have the book of Shoftim, for example, in the Bible. It's coming up soon. And we also have Parashat Shoftim. So Shoftim means you go into court. And there's a judge there. He's got to listen to both sides, blah, blah, blah. And it was foreshadowed last week in Yitro when Yitro himself said, hey, Moses, you're knocking yourself out. Really, you have to slow down here and appoint people to handle magistrates, judges. So that's the opener. And what I found interesting, I put the covenant code in. I think I came across that term. I said, oh my God, you got so many codes here. My head's splitting here. But it turns out that's a very important topic. I didn't realize it. So, and the covenant code is actually this whole section, except for the last 6 or 7 verses, comes from a different place in history. So I found this on my own. Of course, it has to do with the documentary hypothesis, which we've had with us for 150 years. It's also known as Wellhausen theory. So what it's saying is, of course, some of us here believe that the entire Torah and the Torah Shabbat Peh, the oral Torah, the Talmud, the whole works was given to Moses, boom, in 1 second. But there's others of us that say, well, wait a minute, is this simply mashal? Is this like a metaphor a little bit? Like, where did he have all that paper and pen? And, come on, he's out in the wilderness. So the documentary hypothesis follows that through the way things are written, the language they're using and just how this all put together, that they're written at different times. Now, as it turns out, I have that Torah that's all color-coded. And I looked it up, and when I looked in that Torah, it was a totally unique layer I had never seen before. And sure enough, they start talking about the covenant code. In other words, this is a special code, as Rabbi Goldstein explained to us, that was set up over time because when we're doing things as a community, people are going to make mistakes. Like, I'm going to drive through a stop sign and I'm going to hit David's car. There's nothing innately immoral about driving through a stop sign, except I'm going to hit your car. So now I got to pay for it. So when I look at anything in Talmud, I look at Mishpatim Parsha, what I'm saying is someone had to sit down and say, oh yes, you got to pay for it. Well, I go, oh, wait a minute, he wasn't looking. All right, we'll give him 30% negligence, blah, blah, blah. And the word casuistry, anyone hear that before? Casuistic? Want to tell us? Or I've heard it. I've heard it in a negative way. when they were talking about the Jesuits in the Christian tradition, Notes Ream, they were always described as being casuistic. And I didn't understand it back in the day. Now I do, because it's kind of like when you have a lawyer, and that lawyer, if I'm right or I'm wrong, he's going to twist it a little bit so that I look a little better and you look a little worse. So it's not always moral. There's like almost like a pejorative element to it. So anyway, that's what I want to add for the difference between chok and mishpatim. And of course, we have another one, mitzvot, commandment.
Yeah. Okay. David, did you have your hand up before? David Gilbert? Did you have something to add about?
No, let it go. I was totally confused by why the ear would be pierced and what it meant that he's got to be done to the doorpost. I didn't understand that at all. I mean, other than it's upright and it may be more convenient to do it, but I just didn't get it. I'm not sure I still do.
And I think there are, there's references in the golden calf incident of the various jewelry that's melted down for it. It includes earrings. So it's not always ear piercings that have to do with slavery, but I think the like piercing it to the door, denoting like this commitment to this household over the like transience of God. There's something to that. And like I said, I don't see it now here in Safaria with the Rashi. There is a commentary that explains it.
Okay.
A little better. Let's see. Okay. Well, Chabad says it is from Rashi, but it wasn't on Safaria there. Why the ear? The ear that heard at Mount Sinai for the children of Israel are my servants, yet this person went and inquired a human master for himself. That ear should be pierced. So yeah, that's a little clearer than the way I tried to explain it before.
Almost like a branding of a cattle nowadays.
Yeah. Right. I think that's part of like the all to the doorpost, that it's big. It's not just like a little hoop or whatever that a woman might wear. It's like, it's noticeable. It's a big piercing, like a gauge, those like big ones that people wear sometimes that stretch out your earlobe. Hi, Debbie.
Hey.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
All right. Well, another one I wanted to bring up then is the miscarriage one. Hold on, let's find that verse. When two men, okay, so it's 21:22. When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So it's clear although it's not, there's not a lot here about terminating a pregnancy, but it's clear that the miscarriage is not viewed as explicitly a loss of life. And so from this, we get the various rabbinic laws regarding terminating pregnancy. As I mentioned in my Devar Torah last week, or, on Saturday morning, the National Council of Jewish Women has dubbed this Friday, or this weekend rather, Repro Shabbat, Reproductive Justice Shabbat. I chose to write my Devar Torah on this topic last week because this Shabbat is our family Shabbat, and that didn't feel super appropriate. But this, because of this line. So throughout our ancient texts, there is conversation about, mostly regarding the health of the woman, that if there is evidence that the life of the pregnant person is at risk, then the pregnancy should be terminated. It's not even like a maybe, it's like should be. And Philip and I once had an argument then of like, what if the woman wants to take the risk? If she feels that being a mother is worth the risk and she chooses to try to continue with the pregnancy, the way the halakha is phrased, like she's really not allowed to, but like that's also a personal autonomy issue, just like we normally talk about the right to terminate. So like who would force her to terminate against her will, and like how that would work. And I don't know. I guess the rabbis assume that the woman herself would put her own life first anyway, so it's not an issue. But that's an interesting thing to consider. And then as the rabbinic law progresses, you see more, in the post-Enlightenment age, although still pretty, we're still talking like a good 200 to 300 years ago, but more justifications for terminating extreme poverty, obviously a non-consensual conception, the mental health of the woman, things like that. And it's complicated. I like the way that Judaism approaches it, although like as a feminist, I can like appreciate the general pro-choice sense of like any reason is an okay reason. It's a personal autonomy issue, whatever. But I really do appreciate the way Judaism approaches it as like, a fetus is not a living thing and should not be treated as such. This conversation about abortion is murder is devaluing to actual living people. However, it is a potential life. And when it was, if it was conceived of either, consensually or irresponsibly or whatever, it should be treated with reverence, and like it shouldn't be taken lightly to terminate. But but then they go on to give all of these reasons that do kind of boil down to any reason that you feel you can't carry this to term is a good enough reason, but they want it to feel weighty at the same time. And I just think that nuance is so important and so missing often from the debate around the political issue of it. David, go ahead.
Yeah, wasn't there some rule that grew out of this, that the fetus, if it was to be aborted, had to be aborted such that it was killed before it left the mother? In other words, once it's actually left the mother, it's now a living being, but until then it wasn't. And so for that reason,
there are various like stages of the halakha around it. So like the first, I can't hold numbers in my head, but the first however many weeks, it's like water. It talks about the fetus is like, basically akin to like bodily discharge from the woman, and it's whatever. Then there are certain, once it's at a certain stage of development that it's viable, like if an emergency C-section had to be performed or something, it would live outside the mother, then it's really only, at that stage, it's really only acceptable to still go through with the abortion if the woman's life is in danger. But if a woman's life is in danger, even up to the moment of birth, if like the birthing process is going so terribly that it looks like she will die before the face comes out, then the rabbi, I think it's Shulchan Aruch that says, and this is gruesome, and I don't know that this, please excuse this, but the Shulchan Aruch says like it's better to like cut up the baby in the birth canal and tear it out limb by limb rather than risk the woman's life. But yes, once it takes a breath, then it's a living thing, and then you just kind of gotta let nature take its course and do your best to save both. But if you can't, like, you can't prioritize one over the other at that stage.
So all these fine points are in the Talmud and not in the Torah.
The Torah really just has this one line that says
one line.
Miscarriage is akin to like breaking her leg.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it's in the way the liability law is written, that it's clear he's not liable for murder, because then it continues on to talk about like, well, if the woman also dies in this altercation, then he's liable for murder. So from that, then so it's based on this law, but the Torah tends to be pretty terse.
Right, but the fact that this is the only place in the whole Torah that it's mentioned, with all the rules and all 613 rules, I mean, they knew about abortion. I'm sure there were abortions in those days like there are now by choice. And yet it doesn't see the need to address itself to them anywhere except here. That in itself says something, I think.
Well, there's two possibilities. One is that the people who physically wrote the Torah, divinely inspired as it may be, were men. And so they just didn't think about that. That was a woman's issue. That was the midwife's problem to help her with, whatever. That like more increasing laws allowing had to be explicitly stated in a cultural environment that otherwise tried to increasingly prohibit it. Like, I think that's a significant shift. I hadn't really thought about that before, but since you say it, like in the Talmud, and for the most part, the early medieval codes, it's almost entirely about the woman's health or the baby's health. Sometimes it's like, if this fetus is like not going to develop properly, there's no point in carrying it to term, which is, I mean, sort of gets into like eugenics and not necessarily a thing we would promote right now. Like, if you think you're going to have a disabled baby, you maybe should, like, you could still have a disabled baby. But anyway, that kind of stuff is discussed in the Talmud and codes. And then it's really like the things that come out of the post-Enlightenment Europe, where, we're starting to get, it's still early before Victorian era, but it's starting to get into that level of like purity and extreme class poverty. I mean, there were feudal systems before, but like now we get like the urban poor and things like that, where like a woman could ostensibly, not have a lot of options in terms of preventing the pregnancy or being able to then pay for another mouth to feed or whatever. So then that's where you start to see, like, I think that is significant that as the culture changes, then the Jewish law becomes more explicitly permissible to counterbalance that. And that maybe in the Torah it was like, well, yeah, if if this altercation terminates the pregnancy, like, that's sad. He should pay for that. But it's not a, it's not a thing.
So it's certainly not shy about talking about other womanly functions and issues.
Right.
So,
but they're mostly in regard to like purity, right? When it talks about other women's bodily functions, it's a largely in the context of don't touch her until X amount of days have passed from that. It does talk about like birth in some detail in some places, but it's largely about like then how long she is on bed rest, when she goes to the mikvah, when the male baby is circumcised versus when the female baby is brought into public. She doesn't really get much fanfare in the Bible. Female baby namings are a later introduction, but it's longer. When a woman gives birth to a boy, she's in seclusion for 7 days, and then on the 8th day, she dunks in the mikveh, she comes out, the baby has the breast. When it's a boy, she's in seclusion for 14 days, and then on the 15th day, she comes out and she makes her gratitude sacrifice or whatever, and then goes on with her life, and nobody looks at the girl child. But so it's that kind of stuff that the Bible gets into more detail with.
Okay.
Is how it affects the men. Dave, go ahead.
Question on a totally different area. Chapter 23, verse 28. What is Syrah?
Hold on. 23,
verse 28.
Rashi says hornets. My English says I will send a plague. So, Shalaxi et Syrah. Rashi says hornets. This is a kind of insect which would wound their eyes and inject poison in them so that they died. Oh. The hornets did not cross the Jordan, and the Hittite and the Canaanite, whom scripture mentions here as being driven out by them, were the inhabitants of the land of Sichon and Og on the east of the Jordan. It is for this reason that scripture enumerates here all of the 7 nations that Israel fought against when entering Palestine. Of all the 7 nations, only these 2 are mentioned. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I didn't have a clue what it was because it's not translated. Mine just says Syrah.
It's not translated in yours. That's interesting. Yeah, my Sepharia translation just says plagues, but Rashi says hornets. Let's see. Do any of the other commentators are different?
Yeah, ours says hornet also, but then it also says that the meaning of the Hebrew is actually uncertain.
Must be.
Mine didn't even translate. It just said Syrah.
That's interesting.
Thank you.
So David, out of curiosity in yours, I'm trying to find just a minute where it is in ours that there's often notes that say the Hebrew is uncertain, and I'm looking to see where the close. Just curious if yours also uses a Hebrew. Okay, in 22:28. Ours translates it as you shall not put off the skimming of the first yield of your vats. But then there's a note that says that the Hebrew is uncertain.
What verse are you on?
22:28.
Okay, I'm on 23:28.
Okay, 22:28.
We're in different chapters.
Oh, I just was looking for the next meaning of Hebrew being uncertain, and I was curious if yours if what yours did with all the Hebrew uncertainties that ours finds.
It says,
Joel
this is
points
where
out
my pages stuck
also
together.
that Syrah has the same root as Sarah, as in like the Tsarat that Miriam is stricken with in Numbers, which is often translated as leprosy, although modern scholars think that that's not, the descriptions don't match, but some kind of skin disease. So that did strike me, but I don't know what the connection between skin disease and hornets are. So the fact that they share a root, I'm not sure that that's significant. I mean, I'm sure it is significant, but I don't know what the significance is. For dim'acha, no, that's this put off. Ta'acher bechor benecha titen li. No, malachtecha dim'acha.
It's okay. I was it's just a curiosity about when Hebrew is uncertain and how often.
Well,
Rashi says Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael translates it as the heave offering, which is not more clear to me. I don't know what that means. But Rashi himself says, I don't know what this word means. Which is helpful. What is your translation on that verse, David?
I had not thought of doing this before. I've got a program called eSword, and I just called that up. And when it looks at Syrah, it refers me to another word, Sarah, to scourge, and that means to be stricken with leprosy, leper or leprous. So that may be where that comes from.
Right. That's what Joel
I should have thought to check this before.
Also, Surus in Yiddish.
Yeah, trouble.
Comes from the same root of like trouble.
Interesting.
So I don't know how all the rabbis agreed on hornets.
Maybe one of them was stung by a lot of hornets and felt that it looked and felt that way. So that's a good one.
I've also got another note in my eSword that says the hornet may be so called from the Arabic zara'ah, to lay prostrate, strike down, because of the destruction occasioned by the violence of its sting. Just a possibility. Looks like people don't really know what it means and they're guessing, but obviously something that is painful and it's certainly powerful enough to drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite. Whatever it is. Don't want to mess with it.
Go ahead, Joel.
About Surus, I just wanted to mention that the Hebrew language is so related conceptually. Now you said Surus, so Sadi Resh is the root, of course, and that's Sur. Sur means a rock. That means being between a rock and a hard place. That's how
I like that.
And also, if you take a look at the word Mitzrayim, you have the Tzadi and the Resh right in the middle. And we generally translate it as meaning a constriction. When we were living in Mitzrayim, it was a constricted place, meaning when you're a slave, you're not free. So here we are, Tzur, and of course, Mitzrayim is the plural. And so it really is not translated Egypt, it's translated Egypts. In other words, before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, which is, a very long time ago. So a lot of these words and concepts and ideas existed many, many years before the Torah. Oh my God.
Right.
So we like to think that the creation of the universe was through the words that were created by the 22 letters. And many times I can really get into that. I can get to some unusual word and I say, oh my God, this is so basic to the creation of the universe and also the creation of us. You know, we're living. At one point, there was no life on the earth, not that long ago, okay? Hundreds of millions of years ago, but, you know, certainly not in the very beginning. So I think that our language is so special. So thank you for tsuris. And yes, I see how it relates to leprosy.
I finished reading our book club book this week. I was listening to it on Audible while I cleaned and walked and stuff. So, but it's called Bee Season for those. I think Debbie's probably the only other one that's.
What's it called?
Bee Season. Not bee as in hornet, spelled that way, but as in spelling bee. So it's about a little girl who is not a very good student in most ways, but excels in spelling and wins her school spelling bee and whatever. And her father is a rabbi of a mystical leaning. And so she gets really into this, you know, as Joel kind of referenced, the like combinations of letters and getting into other, you know, like really envisioning them mixing and, you know, that there are whole worlds encapsulated in letter combinations, and that like there's a magic to them if it can just be tapped into correctly. This is very interesting. Though I was disappointed in the ending of the book, but otherwise I loved it. All right, what else? Other points of the Parsha to hit on? The Shemitah stuff is always interesting to me. Oh, Debbie, you look like you had something else to say. Go ahead.
I just, I came in late and I apologize, but did you discuss the meaning of the Mishpatim, of those kind of rules? I remember, I think from a sermon you did in past years, how that word sort of separated out the rules for daily living as opposed to the rules for worshiping and I liked that, and I didn't know if you hit on that today or not.
Yeah, we did. Sorry that you missed it, but we talked a little bit about that. The difference between Mishpatim and Hukim primarily as the two categories, although as Joel pointed out, there's also mitzvah, which is commandment. Occasionally you see Eidah, which is like a ruling. So they're all kind of synonyms, but yeah, there's an understanding as we see in this Parsha that Mishpatim are like the civil laws. They follow a human logic. There's a action and consequence. They're about how we treat each other and live in community, as opposed to Hukim are primarily about our relationship with God and they don't necessarily follow a logic, but they're just because God said so.
And does it follow the same route as Mishpucha?
No, it follows the same route. Joel got into this a little bit, that the route is the same as Shoftim of judges. So again, it kind of falls into that category of, you know, there's a whole legal system here to follow, and that we're all sort of responsible for and to each other. I'm going to think about other connections for Mishpacha though.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for going back. Go ahead with what you were going to say.
Okay. what was I going to say? Oh, Shemitah. I just think Shemitah is it's one of those things that like, it's one of those areas of Tanakh or, or of ancient Judaism that's just so, I think, ahead of its time that there is no, like, they didn't have the science of soil nutrients or whatever, but they could see the issues of overtaxing soil. And so they had this system of everything needs a Shabbat. And for a land that like is a, more complex series of organisms rather than a human body or a cow or whatever, one day doesn't quite do it. We need a full year every 7 years to let the land lay fallow, to let the soil regenerate its nutrients. And then there's other stuff too involved of that, like the people who work it and whatever. And then every seventh Shemitah, so every 49 years, then there's a jubilee in which all slaves are set free, all land returns to its original owners, all debts are forgiven, things like that. So like there's a really meaningful, it's like a small piece of the narrative of Jeremiah. And so often the prophets, because it's so much like just the poetry of the prophecy, the actual narrative of their lives gets lost. But there is a point in the book of Jeremiah where he has to go get the like redemption notice or whatever for the land for the next Jubilee. And it's significant because he knows that they're about to be invaded by the Babylonians. So the significance of getting the redemption note or like the piece of paper that claims his land for the next, in 49 years or whatever the next Jubilee is at that point, like it shows the faith in that even though we might be about to be exiled, we will return to this land, and this land still has to return to my family clan at some point. So that's an interesting application we see of Jubilee. There's also, I don't know how Jubilee fully plays out in Israeli law. There are Shemitah only applies in the land of Israel. And now in the modern land of Israel, there's all kinds of workarounds so that their agricultural economy doesn't shut down every 7 years. But they had to come up with the workarounds. Like they do follow the law of Shemitah more or less in the land of Israel, in the modern state of Israel, which is, cool, I think, that they do that. So I don't know exactly how the Jubilee functions, but I do know that there is a policy of like, you can't really own land in Israel. You can sign like long-term, like 49-year or whatever leases in which you effectively own land. But there's this concept around Shemitah and Jubilee that the land belongs to God and no person, and like there are certain apportioned sections that go to the clans and the tribes and whatever, but like we have to remember that we don't really own anything. It all goes back to God. So there's that similar concept of that it has to be, we have to pay tribute in some way, that even if you renew your lease every 49 years or you pass during that 49 years and you are still able to give it to your children, and so there's still inherited wealth the way there is in the US or whatever, there has to be some acknowledgement at least in that process of just our finiteness as humans, but the infiniteness of God and the land.
I always wondered about how that worked practically. I mean, I can see leaving your land fallow every 7 years, but having everybody do that the same year as opposed to altering. I always wondered how that worked out practically. And then the idea of the Jubilee year, what if you needed a loan the year before the Jubilee year came? Who would want to lend you money the year before? And
there is rabbinic law and writing around that, because that was obviously a problem, that the year before the Jubilee year, nobody wanted to give loans, and it became a problem. And I don't remember exactly what their workaround was for that, but they did have to write.
They did deal with it. They
had to address it. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think the issue, or the way of living during Shemitah, is that a lot of fruits, at least, are perennial. So they require some care, but if you let it lay fallow 1 year, you're still going to have apples and, and there's, and because you're letting it lay fallow and you're not pruning, you're not harvesting, you're not selling, there's also this equalizing thing that happens that year where everything is like the corners of the field. Everybody gets to just go glean wherever and whatever they want. I mean, within reason, I think there are rabbinic laws that sort of equate it to like the quails in the desert, right? Like if you take too much, it's rotten by morning. So you take what you need, but there's an equalizing factor to it.
Okay, so the wheat will grow wild that year, but there will be some wheat if it's not. And you put stuff in the storehouse to get ready for it if it was a good year before. Yeah.
Make lots of tomato sauce the year before. Eat a lot of cheese that year. Yeah, Joel, go ahead.
In a practical sense, it works that way right here in America. If you buy options on stocks from the Chicago Board of Options Exchange, there is something called a strike date. And when you're approaching that strike date, your option is going to lose value and someone else can buy it. So let's say you're in the land of Israel, somewhere else, maybe Bulgaria. Let's say in 10 years, you have to give up that lease. Now on year 1, I'll pay full price. If someone buys it for me in year 2, means there's 9 years left, they're going to pay 90%. By the time you get down to year 7, someone's going to say, wait a minute, I only got 3 years left. I'll pay 30% of that. In other words, you just proration it. And if you think clearly, this house that I'm living in, I know my name's on the deed, but in time, it's not going to be mine anymore.
Same here. Yep.
I don't really know how stocks work, but yes, that sounds correct.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
When you started to say that, I thought
Joel,
you were
I think that's
talking
an excellent
about agriculture, and that's definitely not how we do agriculture in this country. Unfortunately, there's a huge problem with monoculture and lack of letting the ground lay fallow, and Monsanto has to change up its ways, or we're going to be eating nutritionless corn and nothing else. But anyway.
Well, we paid in the 30s, so hopefully someone will put 2 and 2 together before it's too late.
Yeah.
Greed is hard to fight.
Yeah, but it doesn't, I mean, I just don't even really understand some of the bad farming practices. Like, you could also make money off of other vegetables. Like, it doesn't have to be just corn.
Yeah.
Don't we feed the world? Isn't there enough food for the entire world? Except it's not distributed properly. But when I was a young man, a number of years ago, the expression was, there are 40,000 children a day who starve to death. And I said, wait a minute, that can't be true. And I looked into it, did the calculation. It was indeed true, not that many years ago. And look how productive we are today. There's food for the world.
Yeah, but we don't actually distribute it to the world.
I think we're doing much better as a society, I think. Yeah, sure, there's a lot of bad stuff going on. Hog farms in Iowa ruining the land, whatever. So the work isn't done.
The task, what's the line from Talmud? The day is long, the task is heavy, the taskmaster is hard. There's a positive end to that. I can't remember that, but it does end nicely. It's in the same part of Pirkei Avot where we get the, it's not on you to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. They're like subsequent verses. All right. Any last thoughts on the Parsha before we close?
No, thanks for all the information. And Joel, I really appreciated the information on the roots of Sur and Saurus and Syrah and Sarah.
As always.
Yes.
Thank you. Even the letters themselves, like the letter Lamed, of course, that's my sign. I was born under Lamed. So you look at a Lamed, it's really a Kuf, which is the 11th letter. And on top of it is a Vav. So here's the Shekhinah that looks over all of us. And the Vav is the hook, which can pull us up to heaven.
Wow.
Nice thought.
It's lovely. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. We'll see you.
Thank you.
I'll have you Sunday for our Pardes exercises.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Stay dry.
Bye-bye.